everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
So we have an opportunity to use technology in a much more sophisticated way, not to pry its secrets out for short-term opulence, but to anticipate how nature changes moment to moment so we can adapt to it.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Jeremy Rifkin, best-selling author, economic and social theorist, and activist. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks. Nice to be here with you.
Jeremy, you have published 25 books, very prolific. You also run a consulting firm that you advise governments and corporates alike. I wonder if you could just give us just a brief overview of the many decades of experience and the things that you've seen.
I began this journey back in 1973. We organized the first protest against the global oil companies. This was on the 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. And it was at the time when OPEC had put on an embargo on oil, and people were upset. And that demonstration, 20,000 people showed up demonstrating against fossil fuels and the oil industry. So it's been a long journey. And over the last many years, our team has been principal architects of the European Union plan to transfer into a third industrial revolution infrastructure and a zero margin of cost society. Our team also was and still is the principal architect of the People's Republic of China's plan called China Internet Plus Ecological Civilization. And we still work with the leadership to move forward this whole technological and infrastructure transformation. More recently, I got together with now Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer back in 2020. He knew what we had done with China and Europe, and said, can we customize a plan for infrastructure shift in this country with all the technologies that come with it? We brought our global team together of architectural firms, urban planning, utilities, mobility and logistics, et cetera. And we did a plan for him that became a good part of the Build Back Better infrastructure plan. We didn't get the money we needed, all of it, but it's a start. So those are the 3 superpowers that our global team has been working with over the years.
So the thing that I think it's important to note is that your activism has started much earlier, in the sense that I think as early as your graduating year in 1967 at UPenn, you organized a freedom of speech rally after seeing some of your frat brothers beat up some of the students protesting the Vietnam War. And then going further, again, these are one of many, I think, things that you've done, but you've also been very vocal against genetically engineered foods or organisms, to even preventing the launch of a NASA rocket back in 1989, claiming it carried a very high risk of explosion and spreading deadly plutonium. Can you give us your insights into your thought process and what drives your activism?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I would say this. I was a generation in the 1960s that did not have a career path. We were caught up in the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. And I never planned this particular journey in life. It's not a career. But I did realize early on that it was important to do the intellectual framing and the research and not just the activism. So I've always believed it's theory and practice and theory. They each enable the other. That's why the books have come along. While we've done a lot of activist work and we've worked with governments and also Fortune 500 companies. I spent 15 years at the Wharton School Advanced Management Program, an executive ed program. I was a graduate of Wharton, but I spent 15 years teaching the Advanced Management Program, where we bring in CEOs from all over the world for 5 weeks. And prepare them for the kind of new ideas that are emerging and the new ways of thinking about commerce and trade. And we do a lot of work with Fortune 500 companies and also with consulting organizations.
In your latest book, The Age of Resilience, Reimagining Existence on a Rewilding Earth, you suggest that worshiping efficiency and economic process, we created this economic system that's placing human species at the brink of destruction. And you then argue that it's time to prioritize resilience instead of to create systems that are more aligned with our nature. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, this is interesting. When I first started working with the leadership of the European Commission back in 20 years ago, we did an interesting experiment. We knew that the industrial age based on fossil fuels was moving toward an end game, but we didn't know what might replace it. So we went into an anthropological journey and asked, how do the great economic paradigm shifts in history occur? If we know how they occur, maybe we can get a roadmap and a compass for the kind of changes we need to make. And when we did this, we found something interesting, that there's been about 7 or 8 major economic paradigm shifts through our history, and they all share a common denominator. That at a moment of time, 4 defining technologies tend to emerge across a society and converge to create an infrastructure, a social organism that brings lots of people together in new ways. And here are what the 4 technologies are. Number 1, new communication revolutions. Number 2, new energy regimes. Number 3, new modes of mobility and logistics. Number 4, new ways of sequestering the waters, hydraulic infrastructure. When these 4 come together, they allow lots of people to come together in many more diverse ways in order to organize social life. It is a social organism. And they change all of our basic ideas about life. They change our temporal spatial orientation, how we govern ourselves, our notions of economic life, how we even conceive our relationship to each other and nature. There's a kind of a belief out there that infrastructure is just scaffolding and that governments create infrastructure. No, infrastructure determine the kind of governance you have in the economies, et cetera. So let's deal with efficiency. Most people think efficiency has been around since the beginning of time. It's what every species is all about. Not true. For all of our history, up until very recently, our species' temporal orientation was the same of every other species. We have myriad biological clocks in every cell of our body, and those clocks are continually interacting temporally with the rotation of the planet every 24 hours, circadian rhythms, the seasonal rhythms as we move across the sun. So for all of our history, up until about 7,000, 8,000 years ago, we adapted temporally to nature, moment to moment, to what was going on in the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. It changed. 10,000 years ago, the last ice age receded. We started to have really nice weather called the Holocene. We settled down from foraging, hunting to agriculture and pastoralization, then the great hydraulic civilizations, all the way to the industrial age. And this is where efficiency came in. Efficiency is how do we extract greater volumes of the planet's spheres, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere. How do we extract greater volumes at higher speeds in shorter time intervals to increase the opulence of our species? That's what it is. The problem is that that's what's taken us to the depletion of this planet. That doesn't mean there isn't a role for aggregate efficiency, but when that becomes the sole dominating, if you will, raison d'etre for society, it takes us to the kind of brink we have now, which is the 6th extinction of life on this planet. So what's happening now is, I think, a younger generation is beginning to realize that, and we need a new reset. Instead of adapting nature to us, we have to reset and adapt our species to nature, because this planet's a lot more powerful than we thought, and we're a lot smaller and insignificant than we imagined. This is a wake-up call. It requires new approaches to science, new ways of addressing technology, new forms of governance, new ways of looking at what a human being is on the planet. That's what the Age of Resilience is all about.
So I want to just do a little bit of follow-up on that. So just from my understanding, so is efficiency in itself bad, and is there a way to be efficient in a better way?
Well, we learned this when the COVID hit. When COVID hit, all of a sudden, everyone was saying, where are the masks? Where are the ventilators? Where are the toilet paper? In standard economics, we express the idea of lean production. In other words, try to be efficient. You don't want to have too much inventory, too much of a redundant labor force. You want to have just-in-time logistics because you want to cut the friction and make sure you have enough revenue to go back to your investors. But then what happens when you have a crisis like a climate event or a COVID epidemic, it all breaks down. In nature, there's no such thing as efficiency. In nature, it's adaptivity. In nature, there's no such thing as productivity. It's all about regenerativity. In nature, there's no such thing as lean production. In nature, it's all about diversity. The more redundant an ecosystem and the more diversity, the more agile it is in order to be able to relate to changes going on around us. So we think about growth. Nature's about flourishing. And what we haven't really realized is that we need now a reset so that we can develop the really, really important technologies of a 21st century shift. And so let me explain briefly what this shift is. The modern shift in communication, energy, mobility, logistics, and hydrology, first industrial revolution, Britain. Communication tool was steam power printing and the telegraph. Energy was coal, no more wood. The transportation was locomotives on rail systems. That took us to national markets. It took us to nation states and to shareholding corporations. In the 20th century, you had a second industrial revolution in America. The technology was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell connected the whole continent. Then the energy revolution, cheap Texas oil. The mobility revolution, the internal combustion engine, Henry Ford. That took us to a new form of hydraulics, these massive dams like the Hoover Dam and the TVA, et cetera. And that took us from national markets to globalization, if you will, and to global governing institutions like the World Bank and the UN, the OECD. What we're seeing now and what our team has done with the leadership in Europe and China and partially here in the US is a third industrial revolution transformation, an age of resilience revolution. The communication revolution, I'm sure you've done much on this, is the internet. We've got 4.5 billion people connected with little smartphones. They're connected all over the world. The energy revolution is millions of people are producing solar and wind because it's now the cheapest energy in the world. Pretty soon it will be much of the human race producing it locally. What they're not using, they're sending up on a energy internet using big data and analytics and algorithms to share that electricity across time zones in the world. That's already all started. Then there's the mobility internet. That's electric and fuel cell transport, powered by electricity from the energy internet. That's going to be global in the next 20 years. And that autonomous transport is going to be using big data and analytics in order to be able to be autonomous. All of those then go together with a new approach to water. We're moving all around the places we deal with in the world in real-time development, not academic. We're moving to water internets to capture water and to be able to use it more significantly. And finally, it all introduces the Internet of Things, which I'm sure you've done podcasts on. And that is we're putting sensors across the planet in our homes, our offices, our wild environments, so we can have a monitoring system so that our human race can know what's going on around us and the planet that we live in. These are the big changes that are happening. They're not scaling, but everything I'm telling you exists. And it's in some places, it's moving quicker than others, especially Europe and China, just starting here in the US, not so much in some other places.
So just a quick comment in terms of smart, sustainable cities. I think this movement has been happening for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
Not sure that it's actually scaled to the point that we would have liked, and certainly
Correct.
IoT is a component of that. But going back to the example of COVID and the mask and some of these kind of frontline worker necessities, you talked about this notion of just in time and some of the efficiencies. So in the case of nature, where there's adaptability, resilience, if we were to apply that in the COVID context of, let's say, 2020, for instance, how would that have looked?
Well, to begin with, we would have had the basic necessities of life that we needed. Had we had, if you will, not a lean production, but if we had an adaptive approach to our logistics, we would have had backup. We would have had backup on logistics around the world. We would have had backup, if you will, on inventory. We would have had alternative ways to move commerce. And I'm not saying this alone. Now, there's been quite a bit of discussion in all of the business community that we got left short. It isn't just Jeremy Rifkin talking about efficiency as an issue here. This is happening all over the business world, and that's the world that I work in. That doesn't mean you don't have efficiency for some things, but it's also important to understand to have redundancy and agility. We have got to learn that nature is our cue. And I want to introduce something else because I think it's something you probably don't cover in your podcast. I'm sitting here right next to the National Institutes of Health out my window. And they've done something that's quite unusual, and it will change the way we think about technology and everything else. They've introduced a revolutionary new scientific project called the human biome. Are you familiar with it at all?
Yeah, I think it's about 10 plus years old, yes.
Yes. And so what they're doing is they're now saying to all of us, and this is very hopeful, that human beings are an ecosystem. We are not a metaphor for this. It's not a metaphor. That we literally are an ecosystem. And that means that all the elements of the four major spheres are coming into us in the form of molecules for a certain amount of time in our cells and organs, then they leave. For example, the water that comes in, and then the molecules leave. And then there's the elements like the phosphorus in my teeth. They came from mountains, and the phosphorus are degraded into the soil. Then the phosphorus came into the food system. Then here, then it's going somewhere else. They also recognize that our bodies are changing moment to moment. We are a semi-permeable membrane. That is, our whole skeleton is replaced every 10 years, the entire skeleton. The liver every 365 days, our stomach cells every month. And then more importantly, they're realizing that we're not alone in our own bodies. There are millions of other creatures in our bodies that we're just learning about. The protists, the archaea, the fungi, the bacteria and viruses. Only 44% of the human body is made of human cells. The other 55% or whatever is not human cells. Only 20,000 genes are human in our body. There are millions of other genes. So what the NIH is telling us, and this is very hopeful for young people, we are an ecosystem. It isn't society and nature. It isn't how technology can actually take nature's secrets and then take them and then use them for the opulence of our society. So the key is adapting to nature in a mindful, sophisticated, technological way. And that's, I think, left out of the discussion on technology. When you go to some of the places where they're using technology, AI and other things, they don't have a sense of a new approach to science. And let me share with that. Our scientific inquiry goes back to Francis Bacon, father of modern science. Francis Bacon said, man was not made for the earth was made for man. And so the scientific method that I grew up on is that we detach ourselves from nature and become observers, objective observers. Then we take nature's secrets and we harness them for our well-being. So what we have done, at least in the last several hundred years of the age of progress, is we have found ways to take more of nature, sequester it, commodify it, propertize it, and use it for our species, almost completely. And so here are the numbers. We're less than 1% of the biomass on the earth, human beings. We're less than 1%. We're using 24% of that biomass, the net primary production, photosynthesis. And in 30 years from now, we'll be using over half, leaving very little for the rest of the species on Earth. And it's the technologies we've used that are the problem. We need new technologies that are empathic to the environment, that are more sophisticated, that can understand it's not just about preempting the environment in order to control it, but it's adapting and adjusting to this very complicated planet moment to moment with more sophisticated technologies. And this is what we call complex, adaptive, social ecological systems modeling. It's being introduced in universities. I'm sure you know this. In the last few years, this isn't 20 years old. It started with complex theory. So we need to be more sophisticated and mindful. And on the other hand, we need to be more empathic about our relationship to our fellow creatures. We're in the sixth extinction event of life on Earth, and we can't just have technologies that are designed to increase the opulence of some at the expense of many. We have to have a more sophisticated approach in our universities and our tech schools on how we can readapt to the natural world.
Case studies to discuss is maybe energy as well as even factories. Part of the issue is because of the fact that we rely so heavily on globalization, supply chain has been choked during times of COVID. And really the infrastructure, and I think this is a direction that we're going as a country, which is good news, is that we're starting to have distributed grid. And you mentioned solar and wind as an example. Part of that distribution is also onshoring manufacturing capabilities. And there we have to be careful not to just have like a handful of manufacturing bases, but to have micro local factories that are smaller in footprint can be adapted to produce just about anything, whether it's in peacetime or wartime, for instance, and be able to do it here. So in the case of COVID, we could have, in fact, produce everything from hazmat suits to masks if we have those capabilities, but we didn't. That's really, I think, where the infrastructure lag is. A lot of what you're saying to me isn't incongruent or inconsistent. It's really what everything is going towards. And in part of the issues that we've had in Wall Street is that we've looked at the financial metrics in a very much pure profit without the externalities that you talk about, right? So productivity has led to the cost of externalities like global warming, killing off forests and so forth. But we don't actually factor that in. But now that we're starting to get into carbon accounting, the equation is broadening to account for those externalities, although we're getting some pushback on the whole, whatever the woke movement, they define it. So things are moving along. But at the same time, if you read some of the latest things that everybody's talking about, like generative AI, for instance, and how search is going to fundamentally change because of that, latest article at the time of this recording from Wired is that, people don't realize things like ChatGPT is going to, it's going to need significant amount of computing power.
Yeah.
Because it's running such large models, and because you have millions of people running queries and calling API services, it's actually going to increase the footprint from the traditional search to this new ways of search. So how do we reconcile what's a good technology advancement versus what's not? And how do we, what's the filter by which we should look at that and then transition to also governance structures?
Remember, I said that the infrastructure revolutions, the 7 or 8 big ones in history, they determine the opportunities and restraints of what kinds of approaches to economic life, governance, temporal spatial orientation, habitats you can have. The first and second industrial revolution infrastructures in the 19th and 20th century were designed to be centralized and vertically integrated because it was so expensive to put in a fossil fuel energy complex and the telegraph and telephone system and the road systems. No monarchy could afford it. We created the shareholding corporation. But when you end up at the end of the line, 200 years later, these vertically integrated organizations, the handful of companies in each of the major sectors of industry pretty much control the market. We have 500 Fortune 500 companies, right? They represent 1/3 of the GDP of the world. That's 500 companies. They have 65 million employees out of a workforce of 3.5 billion people. And these 8 richest individuals on the top of that pyramid, their combined wealth equals the accumulated wealth of 1/2 the human beings on Earth. There's something wrong with the way we're advancing science, technology, and economic rights. So I agree with you. There's something wrong here. What we're finding out, and we didn't see this at first, as we started to move this third industrial revolution infrastructure in the EU and China, and now in the US, it began to morph in ways we didn't quite know, we didn't understand. It's turning into something we didn't anticipate. And that is, we began to realize, for example, that Berners-Lee may have the last laugh. He said, I'm going to give you a web, a global web, so that everyone on the periphery can address each other and not have a referee at the center. Now, it's true that the first big companies going into the internet and AI, you have Dell and Microsoft and then Google, et cetera. They're vertically integrated, right? All right. I don't think they're going to be here in 40 years from now in the way we see them now. And the reason is, and as you know this, is that we are now putting sensors across the world, and there's too much data. That's why edge data centers are coming in. So let's say you have an autonomous vehicle and it's about to crash in your neighborhood. You send that data to a remote data center, big company, even though it's quick, it's not quick enough. Right now, we're introducing thousands and thousands of edge data centers, as you know. Pretty soon, edge data centers will be everywhere so that they can be agile, like an ecosystem with a lot of diversity and handle things going on locally and globally. There will still be global. But what we're beginning to see is a shift from cloud computing to fog computing. You know that's happening. And this is shifting us from globalization to glocalization. It's not just about onshoring. I'll give you an example. I'm sure you do a lot of shows on 3D printing, fabricated manufacturing. So a lot of real estate now is moving into 3D printing and fabrication manufacturing. And they are now setting up, for example, whole homes here in Virginia, all poured out from a 3D printer within somewhere between 2 or 3 days at a time. So here's what you can do. Let's say you're an architect. There's a guy named Cucinella in Italy, big architect. He's just developed a 3D printed home using clay, which is a substance we used in history. He can then take that software and then he can send that from Italy to the Philippines in a provider user network, not a seller buyer market. And that developer in the Philippines pays a leasing arrangement to be able to spit out those homes in the Philippines for a certain amount of time. We're moving from seller buyer markets to provider user networks, from ownership to access in some regard. This takes us to globalization. But we also have to realize that climate change doesn't give a damn about political boundaries. These disasters, the atmospheric rivers and the floods and the droughts and the wildfires, they don't care about political boundaries. We have to shift not only to localization, but bioregional governance. We're not going to give up nations or states or communities and municipalities. And here's where America's ahead. The one place we're ahead, we've done this here. We have two great bioregions, I'm sure you know. One is the Cascadia bioregion in the Northwest, all the Northwestern states, Oregon, Washington State. And they're in alignment, Idaho, with the provinces in Canada, British Columbia, Manitoba. And for 30 years, they actually steward their common ecosystem for business, for governance, for society. The other one is the Great Lakes Laurentian bioregion, 30 years, all organized. And those are the 8 states that abut the Great Lakes and the 2 Canadian provinces. And again, that's 20% of the fresh water left in the world. So China has become the second place to move toward eco-regions and bioregions. Europe hasn't done that yet. So this is a real plus that the U.S. is somewhat ahead in this. These are ways to use a more sophisticated approach without throwing out everything that's come before, but now changing it in some ways and modifying it, in some ways really transforming it so that we can learn to live in a world that's warming. We are in the 6th extinction event of life. And if there's anyone listening here to me, we've got kids now, 5-year-olds, and we're talking about mass extinction in the lifetime of these kids. Half the species on this planet may not be here. They've been here for millions of years. So we have an opportunity to use technology in a much more sophisticated way, not to pry its secrets out for short-term opulence, but to anticipate how nature changes moment to moment so we can adapt to it.
First of all, I was going to say that a lot of these principles are really what indigenous people around the globe have had. Now, with that said, some of this notion of kind of regional governance around some of these bodies of natural resources like lakes, for example, I think that cooperation, that collaboration is critical, and glad to see that's happening. For the remaining, just about a minute we have remaining, if you could talk about primary and secondary education, what would you want to see different in order for them to adapt to this age of resilience?
We are too ingrained in isolating ourselves in academic disciplines. So the economists don't talk to the anthropologists don't talk to the chemists don't talk to the physicists. We're learning now that all these disciplines need to come together in what we call interdisciplinary pedagogy from grade school on, so that young people can see ecology not as a discipline, but a frame of reference for understanding our relationship to the earth. But then all of these academic disciplines need to come together in this new scientific approach called complex adaptive systems thinking, and begin to prepare a generation that can think in systemic ways and be mindful. This is a big, powerful planet that's very, very complex, and our disciplines are very narrow. So it's starting to happen, as you know, at some of the major universities, especially the graduate divisions, are beginning to do this. We need to do this from grade school on. And we also need to raise our children not to be afraid of nature. This is a real problem. A lot of young people are on the screen all day long. And if we internalize our lives and go into the metaverse of a virtual world in order to fend nature off because it's so scary, we will lose our ability to maintain ourselves on this planet. I'm in favor of virtual worlds, as you know, and all that technology. But we also have to reacquaint our young people with nature, not on a short 3-minute clip on YouTube, but on getting out there in stewardship and clinical learning. That's beginning to happen too. 8 of the 10 largest school systems in the country are starting to do that in service learning. So these are all things that are useful and helpful.
Thank you for joining. I've been joined by Jeremy Rifkin, author of The Age of Resilience. Thanks for joining today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.